Richard never expected that one quiet Tuesday morning would shatter the trust he thought he still had with his family. Sitting alone at his kitchen table in Ohio, the 65-year-old widower unfolded his monthly credit card statement and felt his chest tighten. Line after line, the numbers glared back at him: $28,500 in charges. The Oakwood Country Club, Magnolia, and Vine Floral, Lakeside Catering for 250 guests. And all of it charged to the emergency card he had given his daughter, Amanda, 2 years earlier, for true necessities only. At first, Richard thought it had to be a mistake, some clerical error. But the deeper he looked, the clearer it became. His own daughter had used his name and his money to fund the grandest day of her life, and deliberately left him out of it. His son David, close to Amanda, must have known too. After all, you don't book a venue and caterer of that scale without the family catching wind. For Richard, this wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal, about being erased from a story that should have included him at its center. The late Margaret, his wife, would have known what to say. Her words still echoed in his mind. Don't let them see you bleed until you know what to do with the blood. And in that moment, Richard decided Amanda and David were about to learn what consequences really looked like. Richard sat there staring at the statement until the numbers blurred. It wasn't just the money, though. The total was staggering. It was the meaning behind it. Amanda hadn't simply spent without asking. She had planned every detail of her wedding, every flower, every chair, every meal, and done so, knowing full well she intended to keep him out. That realization cut deeper than any dollar amount could. He rose from the table, gripping the back of the oak chair where his late wife Margaret used to sit, and tried to steady himself. I'd always been the voice of reason in the family, the one who could slice through emotional fog with a single sharp truth. Her words rang in his mind. Don't let them see you bleed, Richard. Not until you've decided what to do with the blood. It would have been easy to explode, to call Amanda and demand answers, to shout until his voice gave out. But Richard had lived long enough to know that the loudest man in the room was often the weakest. No, he would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. If Amanda and David thought they could erase him quietly, then they were about to find out how loudly silence could speak. He picked up a pen and began circling charges. The Oakwood Country Club deposit, extravagant Magnolia and Vine Floral order, the catering service, the photography package, each one felt like a line of betrayal carved into his trust. And yet, in the middle of the storm building inside him, Richard found something he hadn't expected. Clarity. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Amanda knew exactly what she was doing. David must have known as well. The scale of the event made secrecy impossible without cooperation. His children, his own flesh and blood, had decided he wasn't worth inviting. They hadn't just removed him from the guest list. They had removed him from the story of their family. The phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. Was David? Against his better judgment, Richard answered. Dad, you free this weekend? David asked in his usual to casual tone.
We're having a little dinner.
Sort of a pre-wedding thing. Pre-wedding. Richard asked, his voice flat. Sounds expensive. There was a pause on the other end. Then David tried to brush it off. You know how weddings are. Yes, Richard said evenly. I do now. The silence stretched until David finally asked, Dad, what's going on? What's going on, Richard replied, is that I'm looking at my credit card bill. And unless there's another Richard Miller in this town booking the Oakwood Country Club for 250 guests, we have a serious problem, David stammered. It's not what you think. Oh, it's exactly what I think, Richard cut in. Your sister was going to tell you, David tried. We wanted it to be a surprise. Richard hung up before David could finish. Not because he couldn't bear to hear more, but because he wanted David to feel the dead weight of that line going cold. Let him sit with the silence. Let him feel the same emptiness Richard felt reading that statement. For the rest of the day, Richard paced through the house. Every corner reminded him of Margaret. Her books still lined the shelves, her favorite mug still sat in the cabinet. He slipped his hand into his pocket and touched the old pocket watch his father had given him. It no longer ticked, frozen in time, but Richard kept it, because it reminded him of something important. Sometimes time doesn't move forward until you make it, by evening. He sat down with a yellow legal pad, not a list of what he had lost, but a list of what Amanda and David thought they had gained. A venue, flowers, catering, photography. It's all paid for with his money. And he knew, with icy certainty, that he could take it all back. For the first time since opening that statement, Richard's hands stopped shaking. His mind was no longer fogged with grief, it was sharpened with resolve. If Amanda and David believed they could erase him, then they were about to learn that he was not a man who disappeared quietly. Richard didn't need to shout, he didn't need to beg, he only needed to act. And with every step he was about to take, Amanda's dream wedding would unravel until she had no choice but to face the father she thought she could discard. The next morning, Richard woke up with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He brewed his coffee, black and bitter, and stared out the kitchen window at the quiet Ohio street. His neighbors waved as they picked up newspapers from their driveways, unaware that inside his house, a battle plan was forming. Amanda thought she could erase him with one bold stroke of deception. David thought he could stand beside her and play innocent. But Richard had no intention of letting either of them succeed. He began with the Oakwood Country Club. It was one of those venues that seemed built for glossy bridal magazines' white columns. Manicured lawns, chandeliers hanging like constellations. Brides dreamed of that ballroom, and Amanda had signed her name to it with his money. Richard walked through the front doors with the same deliberate calm he'd carried into negotiations during his years as a warehouse supervisor. Knew how to speak when he wanted to be heard, and more importantly, he knew how to stay silent until someone else revealed their weak point. "Good morning, sir," the receptionist greeted. "Do you have an appointment?" "I need to speak to whoever handles bookings," Richard said evenly. "Last name Miller. Event scheduled for next month." The woman typed quickly, her polite smile faltering as she scanned the screen. "Yes, I see the booking, but the account holder is Amanda Miller." "That's my daughter," Richard replied. "She used my card without permission." He slid the credit card statement across the counter like it was Exhibit A in a trial. Woman's expression stiffened. "See, well, in cases like this, we can issue a cancellation if the cardholder disputes the charge." "I'm disputing it," Richard said firmly. By the time he walked out into the cold morning air, the contract was void, the deposit frozen, and the grand ballroom Amanda had chosen was no longer hers. Step one was complete. That evening, his phone rang. Amanda's voice came sharp and furious. "Why did you cancel my venue?" "I didn't cancel anything," Richard answered calmly. "I disputed a fraudulent charge." "You're unbelievable. Do you know what you've done?" Richard said, "I saved myself nearly $10,000, a shred of dignity." "You're ruining my wedding?" she shouted. "No, Amanda," Richard said softly, but firmly. "You ruined it the moment you decided I didn't belong in it." The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was rage, pure unfiltered rage. "This isn't over," she hissed. And then the line went dead. Richard set the phone down on the counter and let the house absorb the echo of her words. She was right, it wasn't over. But she had no idea which way this was going to turn. The next morning, Richard drove into town and stepped into Magnolia and Vine Floral, the boutique florist Amanda had chosen. The scent of roses and lilies was so strong it nearly masked the bitterness on his tongue. A young woman greeted him, then led him to the back where the owner, a middle-aged man with sleeves rolled up, was wiring orchids into an arch. "You must be Mr. Miller," the man said without looking up. Richard froze. "You know my name? Your daughter's been in here often? She talks?" The florist finally looked at him. "So I'm guessing you know about the order." "You also know she used my card without permission," Richard said. The man hesitated. "Look, we've already sourced some of the flowers, imported stock. I can't refund everything." Richard leaned in slightly, his voice steady. "Can I?" "You refund half," the man admitted. "And the rest?" "I can hold the flowers for another event." Richard's jaw tightened. "What I want is for those flowers never to appear at Amanda's wedding. Can you guarantee that?" The florist nodded reluctantly. "If that's what you want, then..." Yes. Richard shook his hand, leaving the shop with half a refund and the quiet satisfaction of knowing Amanda's perfect floral dream had wilted before it even bloomed. The real test, he knew, would be the catering. Lakeside Catering was run by one of David's college friends, a connection that meant they would not easily back down. When Richard called, the manager tried to shut him down immediately. "Mr. Miller, we've already received full authorization from your daughter. Cancellation isn't an option." "She's not authorized to use my account," Richard said flatly. "That's between you and your daughter. Our contract is binding." "And let me be clear," Richard said, his voice like steel. "If you show up at that event with food I've paid for without my consent, I'll make it public. I'll make sure every client of yours knows how you handle unauthorized payments." There was silence, then a long sigh. "Fine, we'll issue a partial refund. But if you want the rest, you'll need to go through legal channels." "Send me the paperwork," Richard replied, and ended the call. That night, his son David appeared on his doorstep, fists clenched, face red with frustration. "What the hell are you doing, Dad? You've canceled the venue, the flowers, the catering. Do you have any idea how much chaos you're causing?" "Plenty," Richard said coolly. "That's the point. This is Amanda's day." David shouted. "No," Richard corrected him. "This is the day Amanda tried to erase me, and you went along with it." David had no reply. He turned and left, his car tires spitting gravel as he sped down the street. Richard stood in the doorway watching the taillights fade, a calm certainty settling over him. They thought he would be quiet, that he would disappear, but now they would have to face him, not in anger, not in pleading, but in the form of consequences they could no longer escape. By the next morning, Richard knew the storm was coming. You don't tear apart a wedding piece by piece without people noticing. The pattern. And right on cue, it arrived. Not from Amanda directly, but from a lawyer. The letter came crisp and smug, printed on heavy stock with the name L. Parker, attorney at law, at the top. The words were short, cold, designed to cut. "Mr. Miller, your daughter disputes your claims. She maintains that you gave her both permission and your blessing. Any further attempt to interfere with her wedding will result in immediate legal action." Richard sat at his kitchen table, rereading the letter until the ink seemed to blur. "Your blessing." That line lodged under his ribs like a splinter. Amanda knew exactly what she was doing, twisting the story, planting just enough doubt so that, if this ever reached a courtroom, he'd look like a bitter old man trying to sabotage his daughter's happiness. He dialed Paul, his longtime attorney and friend. Paul listened without interruption, then gave a weary laugh. "So they've lawyered up," he said. "That means you stopped playing nice." Richard leaned back, his eyes drifting to Margaret's picture on the mantel. "Then let's stop." Afternoon, he walked into his bank in person. Vanessa, the branch manager, greeted him with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd known him for years. She knew Margaret too on Richard, could sense she already understood what was happening. "I want to put a freeze on my line of credit," he told her, sliding his ID across the desk. "No linked cards. No pending transactions. Nothing moves without me standing here in person." Her eyebrows lifted. "Mr. Miller, that will lock out any secondary users, including your daughter." "Exactly what it will do," Richard said. His voice wasn't angry. It was final. By the time he left the bank, Amanda's access was gone. If she wanted to keep her fantasy wedding alive, she'd have to do it with her own money. That night the phone rang again, Amanda's voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You froze the account? Deposits are due, Dad. What are you thinking?" Shh, almost laughed. "That's the thing about deposits, Amanda. They're not guarantees, they're promises. And promises can be broken on both sides." "You're trying to humiliate me?" she shouted. "No," Richard said calmly. "I'm giving you a lesson in consequences. Humiliation is optional. That part's up to you." The line went dead, and Richard sat in the heavy quiet that followed. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was control. And control, after weeks of deception, felt like air in his lungs again. The next step came through an old friend. Jerry, a retired firefighter who still kept close ties with the city's inspection. Offices met Richard in his garage over black coffee and the smell of motor oil. I'm not asking you to bend rules, Richard said quietly. Just make sure Oakwood Country Club gets the inspection they've been dodging. Jerry smirked. They'd been running on a temporary occupancy permit for months. If they try to host an event without renewing it, the fire marshal will shut them down before the first toast. Richard nodded. Then let's make sure the rules do what they were built for. By midweek, word was spreading. A clerk at City Hall confirmed the venue's permit was due to expire before Amanda's wedding date. A few calls later, Richard knew the fire marshal's office had scheduled an inspection. Amanda thought her father was simply cutting checks and causing headaches. What she didn't realize was that the foundation of her entire event, the ballroom itself, was built on paperwork that could crumble with one push. That evening, Richard sat in his study with a yellow legal pad and wrote the next set of lines. Not just money lost and money returned, but strategy. Venue, disputed. Contract void. Florist, partial refund. Remaining stock withheld, catering, refund pending. Legal channels open. Bank, accounts frozen. Secondary access revoked. Venue permit. Inspection scheduled. Occupancy, unresolved. He underlined the last one twice. For the first time in days, he slept through the night. No pacing. No restless tossing. Just the steady breath of a man who'd remembered his spine. Margaret would have been proud not of the fight itself, but of the way he chose to fight. Quiet, sharp, unflinching. Amanda still believed she could outspend or outmaneuver him. She thought calling lawyers and writing checks from new accounts would make him disappear. But Richard knew the truth. Weddings are built on contracts, on signatures, on rules. And rules, when enforced, don't care about flowers or lace. They only care about who holds the pen, and this time the pen was firmly in his hand. Richard wasn't naive. He knew Amanda wouldn't surrender easily. She was Margaret's daughter in more ways than once, stubborn, clever, determined. But where Margaret's strength had always been anchored in truth, Amanda's had twisted into entitlement. Still, Richard also knew he didn't need to win the war in one strike. He only needed to keep pressing until the foundation beneath her began to crack. That crack appeared sooner than he expected. It came in the form of an email from Lisbon, Portugal, yes, Lisbon. The name at the bottom read Peter Alvarez, attorney at law. Richard blinked twice before realizing what it meant. Margaret had once handled family finances quietly, tucking away documents in her study. They're buried in a folder he'd only recently found. His correspondence with Alvarez. The letter confirmed what Margaret had, safeguarded years earlier. The Miller home was solely in Richard's name. Amanda and David had no legal leverage. And more than that, there was another property, something Richard hadn't even known about. A villa in Portugal, purchased by Margaret, deeded only to him. For a long moment, Richard just sat in his den. Holding the paper, the old clock ticking loudly on the mantel, he imagined Margaret smiling faintly, as if she had always known this day would come, that their children might one day confuse inheritance with entitlement. She had left him a way out, a place to stand when the ground at home gave way. Richard reached for the phone and dialed the number Alvarez had listed. The attorney's voice was calm, reassuring, practiced. Mr. Miller, your ownership is not in question. The house is yours outright, and the villa in Algarve is legally deeded. To you, if your children attempt to pressure you, they'll have no standing. I'll draft a cease and desist immediately. The words felt like a lifeline. It wasn't just about money. It was about position, control. Proof that Richard wasn't some tired old man who could be bullied into submission. Later that evening, he phoned another contact listed in Margaret's file, a caretaker named Anna, who managed the villa overseas. She answered warmly, with an accent that carried patience. Mr. Miller, I've kept the villa as your wife requested. It's ready whenever you are. For the first time in weeks, Richard allowed himself to exhale. Margaret had thought of everything. She had even thought of this. That night, Richard spread out his yellow legal pad again and drew 3 columns. What they know, what they don't what. I want them to think and do what they know, he wrote. Venue canceled, florist refunded, catering, disputed, account frozen. Under what they don't, the villa, the overseas lawyer, the depth of his resolve. Under what I want them to think, that he might be wounded, rattled, ready to give in. Asterisk it steadied him. Margaret used to say that order was the antidote to chaos, and Richard was finally beginning to see her wisdom. Days later, Amanda and David showed up unannounced, a lawyer in tow. They sat stiffly in his living room, voices full of polished confidence. They talked about the future, about reasonable arrangements, as if Richard were a bank account to be negotiated rather than their father. Richard listened quietly, nodding occasionally, his pocket watch heavy in his hand. Finished, he spoke just once. "I am not a resource to be managed. I am not selling my home. If you attempt to force my hand, you'll find the law doesn't bend as easily as you think." Their lawyer cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Amanda's jaw tightened. David looked at the floor. Richard stood, walked to the door, and opened it wide. "This conversation is over," they filed out, frustration painted across their faces. Richard closed the door gently but firmly, feeling the click of the lock like punctuation. Later that night, he opened a package Alvarez had sent. Inside were official documents confirming the villa deed and cease and desist. Letters mailed to both Amanda and David. Richard set the papers on his desk, then began sorting his belongings. Into 3 neat piles: go, stay, travel. Clothes and essentials for the villa went in to go. Margaret's keepsakes, his books, his old tools into stay. And under travel, he placed a refundable one-way ticket to Portugal's escape hatch. Should he need it, he moved through the house with a steady rhythm, boxing up Amanda's and David's personal items that had lingered for years. The trophies they'd left behind, the sweaters they'd forgotten, the old college posters still rolled in the closet, packed them carefully, labeled each box, and arranged for delivery to their homes the following week. Movers carried everything away. Inside each box, Richard slipped a note written in his own sharp hand: "Returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me." When David showed up at his doorstep later, eyes blazing, calling him selfish, Richard didn't flinch. Didn't yell, he didn't argue. Simply closed the conversation with the same calm finality he had used to shut the door days earlier, for the first time in years. Richard felt something Margaret had wanted for him all along: control. He wasn't a man waiting for permission to exist in his own family. He was a man who decided firmly and quietly what stayed, what left, and what would never again be stolen. Richard had spent his life being steady for Margaret. Steady for the kids, steady for the warehouse crews he supervised through long winters and endless summers. But now, steadiness meant something different. It meant preparing for the storm his children had unleashed, the night after the movers cleared Amanda's and David's boxes from his home. Richard sat at his desk with the yellow legal pad open. He drew a line down the middle and wrote 3 columns. What they know, what they don't, what I want them to think. It was part strategy, part survival. Under what they know, he listed: venue gone, florist refunded, catering challenged, bank, accounts frozen, lawyer engaged. Under what they don't, Margaret's villa in Portugal. The cease and desist letters from Alvarez, the depth of his resolve. And under what I want them to think, that he was tired, maybe even softening, a father who might eventually give in. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the pen against the page. Margaret had always believed in clarity. She would have smiled at the order of it, the way her husband was finally treating this like a chess game instead of a family squabble. The next morning, Richard drove into town to open a post office box. It was something he'd never needed before. His mail had always come straight to the house, same as his parents and grandparents before him. But times had changed. If Amanda and David wanted to fish for leverage, they wouldn't find it in his mailbox. A P.O. box was a small wall, but a wall nonetheless. From there, he went to his lawyer Paul's office to sign documents Alvarez had forwarded. cease and desist letters were officially mailed to Amanda and David, reinforcing what Richard had already made clear: they had no claim on his home, no right to his accounts, and no power to treat him as a blank check. Paul, a man who had spent 30 years in the trenches of family disputes, looked over the stack and nodded. "You're not just defending yourself, Richard. You're sending a message." That evening, Richard returned home and pulled a slim, Envelope from the drawer, refundable one-way ticket to Lisbon. He'd bought it quietly, more as a symbol than a plan. If Amanda and David kept pressing, if they tried to corner him legally or emotionally, he had an escape hatch. A new beginning in the villa Margaret had secured for him. He placed the ticket under his ledger, reminder that control didn't mean shouting, it meant options. In the days that followed, Richard sorted his belongings with deliberate care. 3 piles. Go, stay, travel. Go was for the things that mattered. If he left quickly, important papers, a few family photos, Margaret's jewelry. Stay was for the pieces of his life tied to the Ohio houses, tools, his books, Margaret's favorite chair. The essentials he could carry without regret: clothes, toiletries, the pocket watch his father had given him. The act of sorting steadied him. Each item placed was another quiet decision, another line drawn. Amanda and David had tried to make him invisible in his own life. But with every box sealed, every drawer emptied, Richard was reclaiming what belonged to him. On Friday, 2 delivery trucks pulled up. The movers he'd hired carried out the last of Amanda's and David's old belongings. Each box was neatly labeled, stacked, and taped. Inside, Richard had slipped a short note: returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. By evening, both children had their past returned to their doorsteps. Amanda's response was silence, silence so sharp it cut more than words. David, however, stormed into Richard's driveway the next day. He pounded on the door until Richard answered. His face was red, his jaw clenched. "You're selfish," David spat. "You're tearing this family apart." Richard didn't flinch. He stood calm in the doorway, his voice even. "No, David, I'm drawing lines you refuse to respect." "What? You're supposed to be the parent?" David shouted. "I am," Richard said firmly. "And that means teaching you something I should have taught years ago? Actions have consequences." The younger man's eyes burned, but he found no opening. Richard's calm was impenetrable. Finally, David turned and left, tires screeching as his car peeled away. Richard closed the door softly, locking it with a finality that felt more like peace than anger. That night, as the house settled into its quiet rhythm, Richard sat in his study. The ledger lay open, the plane ticket tucked beneath it, the pocket watch heavy in his palm. He was not a man waiting to be erased. He was a man writing his own lines, one careful stroke at a time. It didn't take long for the counterattack to arrive. Richard had expected it. Amanda was nothing if not predictable when cornered. 3 days after David's outburst in the driveway, a black sedan pulled up in front of Richard's house. Out stepped Amanda, her brother, and a man in a navy suit carrying a leather briefcase. Richard opened the door before they knocked. He'd seen the car crawl up the street from his living room window and knew exactly what this visit was meant to be: a show of force. Amanda marched in first, her heels clicking against the hardwood as if she owned the place. David followed, arms crossed, jaw set. The lawyer lingered behind them, his polished smile a little too rehearsed. "Dad," Amanda began, her voice tight. "Rehearsed. We're here to talk about the future. About how this family needs to move forward." Richard motioned to the sofa, though he didn't sit himself. He remained standing near the mantel where Margaret's photo rested, silent witness. To the confrontation, the lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller, my clients are concerned about your recent decisions. Canceling contracts, freezing accounts, sending back their belongings. These actions suggest confusion, perhaps stress in the wake of your loss." Richard's eyes hardened. "Confusion?" He let the word hang, sharp and deliberate. "No, son. I see clearer now than I have in years." Amanda leaned forward. "We're just trying to make this easier for everyone. The house is too big for you, Dad. You don't need all this space. Selling it would solve so many problems." Asterisk, and whose problems would those be? Richard asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. Amanda's eyes flickered, but she pressed on. "We've already spoken with buyers. The market's strong. Could move somewhere smaller, more manageable. We could take care of the details." Richard almost laughed. Take care of the details. That was the language of someone circling an estate, not a father. He glanced at the lawyer. Tell me something. Your clients know the mortgage on this? The house was paid off years ago. Margaret handled it in full before she passed. The lawyer blinked, caught off guard. Amanda shot a sharp glance at David, whose face paled slightly. Richard continued, "This house isn't a burden. It isn't a liability. It's my home, and it will remain mine until I say otherwise." David finally spoke up, his voice tinged with frustration. "Why are you being so stubborn, Dad? We're your family. We're trying to help you." Richard straightened, the weight of Margaret's words steady in his chest. "Don't let them see you bleed. You're not helping," he said evenly. "You're circling. You're treating me like a resource to be managed, not a father to be respected." Amanda's lips pressed into a thin line. "So that's it? You're just shutting us out?" Richard walked to the front door and opened it wide. The late afternoon sun spilled into the hallway, casting long shadows across the floor. He said softly, "I'm drawing boundaries. There's a difference."
Allie!
The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, gathering his papers. Amanda and David exchanged a look torn between anger and disbelief. Finally, Amanda rose from the sofa. "You'll regret this," she snapped. Richard met her gaze, unblinking. "No, Amanda. I regret letting it go this far without drawing the line sooner." They filed out, the door closing behind them with a firm click. Richard stood for a long moment, breathing deeply, the quiet house wrapping around him like armor. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like a man under siege. He felt like a man who had reclaimed his ground. That evening, as dusk settled over the Ohio street, Richard returned to his desk. He added another entry to his ledger. Confrontation. Complete. Boundaries declared. Margaret's photograph seemed to glow in the lamplight, her eyes calm, approving. Richard wasn't naive. He knew Amanda and David would come again, but the balance had shifted. No lawyer, no intimidation, no guilt-laden speech could undo the truth. The house was his, the law was on his side, and his resolve was unshakable. For the first time since Margaret's death, Richard allowed himself a small smile. He was not the one being erased. He was the one writing the story now. 2 weeks. After Amanda and David stormed out of his house with their lawyer, Richard received a thick envelope from Lisbon. The return address bore the name Peter Alvarez, attorney at law. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. Not from fear, but from the quiet gravity of what he was about to confirm. Inside were neatly prepared documents, the deed to his home in Ohio confirmed to be in his sole name. The Sesandazis letters already served to Amanda and David, and most shocking of all, the official deed to a villa in Algarve, Portugal. The papers were signed, notarized, indisputable. Margaret's foresight reached across an ocean. Richard sat in his study, the lamplight pooling on the papers as he ran a hand across the smooth pages. Margaret had thought of everything. Even after death, she was protecting him, protecting the life they had built, and shielding him from the greed of their children. He whispered to the empty room, "You always were 10 steps ahead of me, Margaret." That evening, he opened his ledger and wrote a new line under what they don't know. Vila confirmed. Legal protection secured, but the documents didn't just reassure him. They gave him courage to take the next step. He moved through the house deliberately, sorting every corner into 3 piles. Go, stay. Travel. And go. He placed important files, Margaret's jewelry, photographs of their early years, and his grandfather's pocket watch. And stay, he left. Furniture, tools, and the old rocking chair where Margaret used to sit with her knitting. He packed simple clothes, toiletries, and the small mementos that would sustain him if he boarded that one-way flight to Lisbon. The act was strangely liberating. Each decision sharpened his resolve, stripping away the noise and leaving only clarity. For the first time since Margaret's death, he wasn't clinging to the past, he was shaping the future. When the movers arrived a few days later, Richard had another task ready. Dozens of boxes, carefully packed, lined his living room. They weren't his things. They were Amanda's and David's leftover belongings from their childhoods and college years. still cluttering his basement and attic. Old trophies, framed diplomas, forgotten sweaters, dusty photo albums they'd abandoned without. A second thought, he instructed the movers to deliver each box to their respective homes. But before sealing them, he had slipped a handwritten note. Inside every box, in Amanda's, on top of her childhood ballet shoes and law textbooks, returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me, David's, among his baseball glove and fraternity banners, returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't spite. It was a message. Father reminding his children that boundaries existed and that their father was no longer willing to be erased. That evening, as the movers drove away, Richard stood in the doorway and watched the last truck disappear down the street. The house felt lighter, cleaner. His home once again. Amanda's silence came first. No phone call, no message, just the cold withdrawal of someone who didn't know how to process defiance. David, however, was different. 2 nights later, he arrived at Richard's doorstep, fury written across his face. "You're tearing this family apart," David shouted, fists clenched. "Mom would never forgive you for this." Richard met his eyes, calm and steady. "Your mother would never forgive what you and your sister tried to do. She saw it coming. She left me the tools to protect myself because she knew." David's mouth opened, but no words came. Richard continued, his voice firm but quiet. "I am not your safety net. I am not your bank account. I am your father. And if you can't treat me with respect, then you will treat me with distance." Younger man's shoulders slumped. His anger was a mask, and it cracked in the silence between them. At last David turned and walked away, his car taillights fading into the night. Richard closed the door gently. He didn't slam it this time. The house hummed with a strange new calm, as if Margaret's presence lingered, approving. He had returned what belonged to them, and he had kept what was his. For the first time he realized he was no longer simply reacting. He was choosing. Choosing what stayed. Choosing what left. Choosing, finally, to live by his own terms. The knock came just after sunset. It's not polite, not hesitant, angry, insistent, rattling the frame of the front door. Before he opened it, who stood outside? He'd been expecting this visit ever since the movers delivered those boxes. When he turned the knob, David stood there, red-faced and seething. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're selfish," David spat before even stepping inside. "Do you hear me? Selfish? After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us. You're tearing this family apart." Richard didn't move. He leaned against the doorframe, his voice calm, measured. "No, David, I'm holding this family accountable. There's a difference." David pushed past him into the living room, pacing like a caged animal. Accountable. For what? For trying to help you? For trying to make sure you're not rattling around in this old house by yourself? You should be thanking us. Richard closed the door quietly and turned. His eyes flicked to the mantel, to the photograph of Margaret smiling in the sunlight. Of their 25th anniversary, she would have known what to say. And in a way, she had already said it. "Don't let them see you bleed until you know what to do with the blood." "You weren't helping," Richard said softly. "You were planning. Around me, you were making decisions as if I were already gone." David froze for half a second, his mouth opening, then snapping shut. He tried again, louder this time. "We had two. You're not thinking clearly. Mom's gone," and your Richard raised a hand. "Stop. Don't you dare use your mother's death as leverage." The words hung in the room, heavy and sharp. David flinched, as if the sentence itself had struck him. "I buried her," Richard continued, his voice low but firm. "I held her hand when the doctors told us the truth. I wake up every morning to a bed that's half empty. Don't you dare stand in my house and tell me I don't know what grief feels like." David swallowed hard, but the anger still burned. "You've changed," he muttered. Richard shook his head. "Oh, David, I finally stopped pretending. Pretending that silence was the same as respect. Pretending that your ambition was concern. Pretending that my role as your father meant I had to let you walk over me. David's chest heaved, his frustration fighting against something deeper: guilt. Maybe, or shame. He gestured wildly toward the boxes Richard had returned, sending all that junk back. What was that supposed to mean? It meant exactly what it said, Richard replied. I'm returning what belongs to you, and I'm keeping what belongs to me. My house, my life, my decisions. Those are mine, David, not yours, not your sister's. For the first time that night, Richard saw his son's anger falter. The fire in David's eyes dimmed, replaced by something more uncertain. But pride wouldn't let him surrender. He turned toward the door, his voice breaking just enough to betray him. You'll regret this, Dad. One day you'll regret pushing us away. Richard followed him to the door, but didn't raise his voice. He didn't beg. He simply said, No, son. The only thing I regret is not drawing this line years ago. David yanked the door open, stormed down the steps, and climbed into his car. The engine roared to life. A moment later, the taillights disappeared into the night. The house fell silent again. The only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Richard stood there for a long moment, the weight of the evening pressing down on him, not sadness, not even relief, but clarity. He locked the door, turned off the lights, and walked back into his study. On the desk sat the ledger, the plane ticket to Lisbon tucked beneath it, and the documents from Alvarez neatly stacked. Richard picked up his pen and wrote the night's entry. David confronted me, called me selfish. I remained calm. Boundaries. Held. Then he closed the book, set his pocket watch beside it, and leaned back in his chair. For the first time, he felt no tremor of doubt, no pang of guilt. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't selfish. He was steady, and for a man like Richard, steady was enough. The days after David's outburst were quiet, almost too quiet. Richard moved through his house as if it were breathing differently, lighter, freer, but also heavier with the realization of what had changed. He had drawn his lines. His children knew where he stood, and there was no going back. One morning, he sat in the study with a cup of black coffee, sunlight spilling across the desk. The ledger was open, the neat columns filled with weeks of notes. What they know, what they don't, what I want them to think. It had started as strategy, but now it felt like something else. A record of transformation. A map of how he had gone from a man cornered by his own family to a man who commanded his own life. The documents from Alvarez were stacked neatly at the edge of the desk. Every page confirmed what Richard already knew in his heart. He was not powerless. The house was his. The villa in Portugal was his. His choices, his freedom, his dignity, those were his too. Margaret had left him the tools, but it was Richard who had finally chosen to use them. He leaned back in his chair, pocket watch heavy in his palm, and whispered into the stillness. I think I understand now, Margaret. You weren't just protecting me. You were teaching me how to stand when standing felt impossible. Later that week, Richard made one final round through the house. The ghost-to-travel piles had been sorted long ago, but this time he walked with a slower, calmer pace. Wasn't moving in panic, wasn't bracing for attack. He was simply choosing. Choosing what to hold on to, what to release, what to carry forward. Amanda never called after the confrontation. David's silence stretched longer by the day. First, Richard thought it would ache more than it did, but instead, the silence grew into something different: space. Space to breathe, to think, to imagine what a future could look like without constant demands, without feeling like a bank ledger in human form. One evening, Richard sat on the porch. As the sun dipped low over the Ohio fields, the cicadas hummed, the air warm and heavy with the smell of cut grass. The first time in a long time, he felt steady, not waiting for the next blow, not afraid of being cornered. Just steady. He knew Amanda and David might come back one day, perhaps with apologies, perhaps with more demands. And he also knew he had the strength to face either, because now his worth wasn't tied to what they wanted from him, it was tied to what he chose for himself. Richard closed his eyes and smiled faintly. Margaret had been right all along. Order was the antidote to chaos. No, he he was finally living by that truth. Richard's story isn't just about property, money, or even betrayal. It's about dignity. It's about learning that love doesn't mean surrender, and that boundaries don't make you cruel, they make you whole. Too many of us, especially as we get older, are told to step aside, to give up control, to be reasonable. But the truth is, we have earned the right to stand tall, to decide for ourselves what belongs to us and what never will. So, I'll ask you this. Have you ever felt pressured to give up something that mattered to you, just to keep the peace? Ain't you were Richard? Would you have drawn the line? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. And if this journey moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us how much strength we already carry inside.